Very excited to jump into tape compression today, and let's get right into it. First, when we are talking about tape compression, the first thing we want to think about, or maybe the first thing that pops into our head, is what's the difference between tape and, say, an analog compressor? Well, if you remember from one of our previous videos, we kind of compared an analog compressor to a bouncer at a club, and a compressor follows a general set of rules. We can think of tape compression very similar to the way that we would pack a suitcase. As we start filling it with things, once we kind of reach this threshold of, how much suitcase can fit, it starts to kind of push back against us, and when we try to shut it, you can feel that resistance. And that's basically what goes on with tape. See, tape compression, it's like a physical medium that's being overdriven. There's no attack and release knobs. It's just real-time saturation and magnetic pushback. And this is really based on how much energy is being sent at the particles of the tape, how saturated the tape already is, your tape speed, formula, and bias. These are all things we kind of talked about in previous videos. Tape hysteresis, pronounced properly this time. Yeah! And then basically also like the inertia of the magnetization and the demagnetization of the particles. And we're going to touch on this today too, and I'm going to throw it in this area here, the Compansion effect, which is compression and expansion that gets applied to tape, or the process of recording to tape and then listening to the playback of tape from noise reduction systems. Most famous probably is the Dolby A type. I believe the B type was used in home systems for cassette playback. So now we have just a couple basics of what a difference between tape compression and analog compression might be. Let's listen. And on this groove bus right here, I loaded up 3 different sets of the Studer. All are set to the same formula, same IPS, same calibration. But what we did was the first one is us kind of pushing in light, so to about -5. Then the second instance of this tape setting is pushing into about 0. So we're driving harder in. And then the final one is where we are going to push into roughly +3, +5 and really saturate this tape. And we're going to listen to the different artifacts that we're noticing from the tape, essentially pushing back from the volume that's being sent to it. So first we'll start again with our typical drum loop, and we have nothing on. So this is just a raw loop. Okay, so now we're going to pull up our first instance where we're sending a light level in, a -5. Now, if you like listening to the kick drum, listen to the point of the kick and how when the Studer kicks in, we're starting to get a little bit of a reduction at it. It feels like the sound is being pulled down or sinking down. However, I would probably encourage you, if possible, to listen to the snare drum, because what we'll hear at the snare drum is we're going to hear a gentle rounding of the transient, most likely, and we're also going to hear a little bit longer of a release. Remember, that's that kind of lag of the tape. So it's kind of responding in real time, and the tape needs a little bit of time to recover. So if you listen to the snare drum, that might really help you hear the difference between this loop when we're in bypass and when we apply tape, even right now at a light level. So you could hear the tail of the snare drum lengthen, and you could also hear the top of the snare and the kick start to round, and that's at a light level. So even if we were using a tape plugin and we had very, very sharp transients, even at really -5, we're going to start to get a little bit of kind of smearing and smoothing. Now let's listen if we are at 0. Again, keep your ear on the snare drum, and what we should start hearing is that tail becoming more dramatic. Now again, if you like to listen to the kick, or you prefer listening to the kick, what you're going to start to notice is we're going to start to hear that splat effect. And the splatting on transients with tape, and again, this is probably a little bit more opinion-based or feel-based, doesn't really feel like clipping to me, but rather it's kind of like a slow smearing, almost like a massaging of the tone.
Keep massaging, please.
into the body of the sound. It's more like the sound begins to bloom rather than poke. So let's listen and notice, if you're listening to the kick, you might start hearing a splat, snare, the tear might start to lengthen, or if you're just kind of listening overall, you might start hearing a shift from in bypass things feeling very pokey to starting to feel like the transients bloom a little bit. Here we go. That's pretty cool, right? That's a lot of that, sampled kind of drum sound, or like when producers are trying to create some really cool loops that feel very vintagey. This is a little bit of that vibe that we hear on those. You could also notice if you're watching the meter that we weren't really even hitting zero. I kind of undershot a little bit knowing that the transients were going to overshoot a little bit, but you could see that even now, if you were using this and not really knowing what to listen for, and you were like, oh, zero is kind of cool, we could already hear what it's doing to the transients and how the kind of lag is creating a different release. We could hear now it's almost like a longer release because the tape is needing a little bit of time to recover. In a sense, what it also feels like is that the tape is pushing back on the sound. And that's what I hear. It's like all kind of like the redistribution of energy. And now we're sending more energy to the tape and it's beginning to respond in a non-linear fashion. And that energy just doesn't go away, it gets redistributed. And we're going to talk about that in a second when we pop up to the signal generator and I kind of show you what the harmonic content looks like when we start to really kind of drive into tape. All right, so now we have our last one where we are overshooting and we're going to get up into the red. So we're really driving hot into this. Let's once again listen. Again, if you're listening to the kick, it's definitely going to start to really kind of blow up now and splat. And the snare, we should really hear that tail lengthen even more and that transient start to feel even rounder. So here we go. And what else we're getting, in addition to the reshaping of the transients, is we're getting something that we get from typical compression. It's kind of bringing everything together. So if you may have noticed as we listen through these, if not, feel free to just go back and check it out again. The hi-hat got progressively kind of louder and thicker as we moved. We're kind of squishing things together. To me, when I hear tape compression, it doesn't feel like the way an analog compressor kind of grabs and releases transients, but rather it does truly feel like an overloading of the system and the system now pushing back on the information that's coming at it. So it's kind of pushing everything down a little bit even, and then we're hearing a little bit of that nonlinear behavior going on in terms of the release and the front end shaping of the transient. But enough of me talking about that, we can actually see it. So down here where I have these tracks labeled heavy, medium, light, and unprocessed, this is exactly what we were listening to now printed. So if we go to here, which should be a nice big old kick transient, and we zoom in, we could see at the bottom, this is what the raw unprocessed looked like, right? Nice healthy wave. At light, we're already getting a shaping of the front of the transient, and we can see here we're getting some flattening out. As we move up, we get more and more non-linear with what's happening, and you could see we're getting a more compressed waveform, even in terms of almost volume too. Like we're not getting up and down, as much in regards to the spike of the transient and then its dip following. So very interesting to kind of see laid out. Some of the interesting things about, non-linear, energy transfer is that the system, so the tape medium begins to kind of bend, color, and react depending on how much level that we're sending. And we can see that. That tends to result in some compression, some distortion, hysteresis, added harmonics. And components that'll do that aren't just tape. We'll see similar responses in tubes, transformers. But the thing about tape that's very interesting, and even with, some of these other components like tubes and transformers, is there is a memory dependent component to it. They don't just react to the present, but they also kind of react to what has just happened. And that's, where our first video on hysteresis kind of touched. It tends to be what we hear as that blurring, smearing, and gelling. So with that said, Now let's hop up, and what I set up here before we get into our next round of listening examples is a signal generator. And I level matched everything. At the end of the signal generator, I popped up a Q3. And again, so that we're not blowing out eardrums here, we're not going to hear the signal. We're just going to see this because this is something we can do with our eyes. What I loaded up was the Studer, a black box, which is working with a PENTODE, and I'll explain why I did that in a minute. And then some popular analog compressors, an 1176 2-to-1 ratio. We can see that we have a generally fast, everything on 1176 is fast, but we have a generally fast attack, a fast release, and we're driving into all these. I set these up so that they're all going to get 10 dB of gain reduction. So we can see here 10 dB on the 1176. We have an LA2A pinned to 10 dB as well, level matched on the in and out. And then I also loaded up the SSL-G bus. We are also here at about 10 dB. With the Studer, we are about +1, so we're going into it kind of hard, but not like we were, say, for example, the last listening example. But we still want to push into the non-linearity of the tape so that we can see what's going on. And that's also what I was doing with the black box. I'm going to explain why, but the PENTODE I chose and really pushed into this, and we are driving pretty hard into this PENTODE here, and then adjusting the output. So now I'll open up the Q3, and when I open up the Studer, let's see what happens. So we're pushing slightly into the red, and we see that we're getting mainly a third harmonic, and then from there everything begins to taper down, but we're dealing mostly with odd harmonics. We have a small even harmonic, which we were also getting when we did in our early video about understanding this. We were seeing that was mainly from the unit itself, and tape is giving us a lot of the third harmonics. Now we pop the black box open, we could see that our third harmonic is still the strongest, but we are dealing with kind of a balance of even and odd harmonics, but similar to what we're seeing with the Studer. We're getting harmonic content. If I open the 1176 now, we can see, again, very similar. We're getting mostly a balance of even and odd harmonics, with the third, again, being one of the strongest that we're seeing. We open up the LA2A now, and the interesting thing about the LA2A is our second harmonic kind of overtakes the third, and that's because I believe the LA2A uses a tube gain stage and I believe an opto attenuator, and that combination kind of tends to favor second harmonics, which we notice as being a little more musical. Some people use the term warm or creamy. Again, we're still getting this, harmonic buildup from all these sources with the redistribution of that energy. Now let's just we'll open up the SSL. Now this one will be the one that's different, and that is because it is designed to be clean. VCAs, fast, accurate, and transparent. And that is living proof. Fast, accurate, and transparent. So you might be asking yourself, hey, man, why are you showing us all these and saying, look at their similar, look at their similar, look at their similar? Because now we're going to go to the listening examples, and I'm going to pop these on, and they are not going to sound similar. Tape is not going to sound like analog compressors. Maybe you might feel differently, but to me, they sound wildly different. So here we are right now with this compression bus. With the compression bus, we are driving about our medium drive into the tape, and I had a meter here set up, so I made sure that all of our examples are level matched. So we're driving into the Studer with our moderate level, and then I set our compressors to all be around 7 decibels of gain reduction, give or take. I have a C2 here added as well. It wasn't sexy enough to make the cut for the signal generator up there. Sorry, C2, but you will be very useful here.
How rude.
Okay, so to refresh our ear, first I'm going to pop on the Studer, and let's listen to the compression and kind of the nonlinear behavior that we are getting from the Studer. Now let's go first to the C2. Notice how the transients are being retained better in the C2 than they were on the Studer. And that's because analog compressors, they apply their gain reduction via electronic circuits like FETs, optocells, VCAs. We're going to leave tubes aside for a second. And they do that with a fairly, and I do put fairly in quotes here because it's interpretive, in my opinion, or subjective, but with fairly predictable behavior. And they have recovery curves that tend to kind of retain the shape and the transients. Let's just toggle between them for a second. So we'll open up the Studer and we'll open up the C2, and let's listen. First, we'll start with the Studer. What I want you to listen to, again, same thing, listen to the front of the transients. The kick, we're going to hear a little bit of that kind of that splat that I was talking about, and the snare, we'll hear the tail, and the transient at the top of that mountain peak, right, the pencil point, is going to be a little bit more rounded. The whole sound should feel to you, well, now I'm telling you, it should feel to you, and if it doesn't, then you're doing it all wrong. It's the complete opposite message I want to send. What it feels like to me is it feels like the whole drum pattern is being pushed down on. Like you're like Han Solo and Luke when they're in that trash compactor and they're seeing the sides kind of closing in on them. Like that's what tape compression feels like to me. And a regular compressor, we're hearing a reshaping of the transients based off the parameters that either the unit inherently has or the settings that we are dialing in. So what I want you to listen for when the C2 kicks on, listen to how the transients still kind of remain, generally intact. They're not super distorting. They still have their punch. We're hearing the tail come up and some of the artifacts of natural compression, but it's not feeling as, say, glued or smushed as the tape version is. So here we go. We'll start with the Studer. Here the C2 has a lot more snap. One more time. I tried to adjust the release to get them similar, so the releases sound kind of similar to me. And I have the attack on the C2 set as fast as possible to try to shave off the front, just to show how the way that the tape kind of handles the front of the transients, even on a very fast setting here with a regular compressor, it's still a different flavor. So now let's compare the Studer to the 1176. That one should be pretty easy to hear, right? Super punchy. You could hear it pumping in a totally different way than the compression or the way that the tape medium is kind of pushing back on the drums. So you could see why a lot of times 1176s are great for parallel drum compression, because you can really get that pumping and that energy, in there to really kind of help, give the drums some life and some breathing. But what happens if we kind of go to all buttons in here and compare that to the Studer? So we're kind of in Brit mode here. So here we go, Studer. Let's push the attack as fast as we can and see if we can shave off even at its fastest. Let's see, and we'll slow the release a little bit. Let's see if we can get closer. That moved us away. So with trying to retain a little bit, different vibe, right? The tape doesn't pump as much to me. It feels like the release of the tape, it's kind of like lag, and the way that it's responding both initially to the energy that's hitting it right out of the gates, and then it's like recovery time, is kind of pulling the drums closer together. Where with the 1176, even with all buttons in, what I'm hearing is I'm still hearing space and that pumping between them. It's super cool and super useful. But what our goal is right now is listening and seeing, what is very similar to tape compression in these mediums, and like how tape compression stands on its own when we are talking. I mean, the C2 and the 1176, while they were different vibes, you could tell they were members of the same family. You could hear a lot of similarity in the way that they were treating the sound source. Right now, we still haven't had anything that's really kind of, treating this information the way that the tape is. Let's see if maybe the LA2A does, because remember the LA2A, again, we saw that second harmonic, we had some little different things, so let's see what that does. Here we go. same kind of thing, a different tone and character from the C2 and from the 1176, but still of the same family. You could hear the pumping, the transients are still generally being retained, they're not distorting, and it doesn't feel like the LA2A is pushing back on the information like tape feels. And last, let's go with the SSL. Super snappy. Let's bring the attack as forward as we can, and let's see again. You can hear the SSL brings the room up a lot more. And everything's still very punchy and very clean. So that to me is a really cool thing that started to help me understand when I was mixing and I'm looking to kind of treat something a certain way, say give it a certain vibe or feel. Understanding what I can get out of a tape unit in terms of compression can help, sometimes reach a desired outcome a lot quicker or get you really, the exact tone and color that you're looking for. And then the inverse is correct, like not really understanding these units and say, wanting a very loud and punchy mix and having, lots of compressors down the line. And then, on your mix bus, you have another compressor that you're hitting and then you slap a tape plug-in on that you're driving into. You might really be shaving down your transients and not quite sure where it is you're losing your punch from or why things are starting to sound a little smeared when maybe you wanted things to feel very clean and open. So now the question for me became, well, what can I use or find that can kind of get us in the realm of this? And I got into thinking, and we're going to have some interviews coming up with Robert Wainscott from Black Box. He's the designer of this, and that's a pure testament to everybody on this channel in regards to us being a small community, but having some really cool dialogue. He found us, jumped in on one of our comments, and then we set up an interview. And I got a chance to talk to him and learn a lot, and I'm very excited to share a lot of that information with you guys, probably coming up really, really soon. So I picked a pentode. Now, pentode tube saturation, it shares tape's energy behavior in some ways in regards to the fact that they both deal with non-linear energy transfer, and they do that with, the creation of, additional harmonics, and that they both add that harmonic content as a byproduct of the kind of energy curve, the amount of energy being thrown at it. And tubes, not identically, but they do tend to push back on the signal in a way similar to tape. An analogy or a way to think of it is if you imagine like you're on stage and those like heavy velvety stage curtains are like in front of you and you're trying to find that, that spot where they separate so you could push through the stage. Like you can make your way through. Eventually the curtain will give way to you. You'll be able to supply enough energy to push through it, but you're going to feel that resistance. It's kind of like, in my opinion, pushing sound into a velvet curtain. You feel that resistance coming back at it, but it's still able to kind of punch through. So what I did was I really kind of drove the pentode up here, and I just kept playing and playing and playing until I got something that felt like they were part of the same family. So let's take a listen, and feel free to disagree with me. Tell me if I'm crazy. Tell me what your thoughts are. If you have some of these tools at home, even, different analog compressors, and you decide to kind of take this experiment under your wing and play around and come up with some settings, even on the analog compressor side, that gets you close or give you a flavor that you feel is in that family, throw them in the comments. We're all here to learn. We're all here to grow. We're all here to have some really cool conversations. So this is something that I felt like we're in the same ballpark. You tell me. They're similar flavor. I just toggled to the low to see if that gave us anything else, because I'm noticing with tape, we're getting a little bit more of the buildup in kind of like the low mids. Like I'll play through it again where the vibe is like we're hearing a similar kind of saturation and compression in terms of like how they're pushing down. But the tape, we're just getting a little bit more, for lack of a better term, and I hate using generic stuff, we're getting a little bit more kind of fatness in the lows. So we're hearing that splat effect, and we're hearing the recovery time lengthening out the tails in a very similar fashion, and the vibe is kind of similar, but tape still just has a little bit more oomph to me in the lows. But again, if you were looking for a creative way, say, to add a little bit of subtle compression to your mix or to your drums, you could add something like a black box. If I was doing a mix and on my drums, I felt like I wanted a little compression, but not conventional compression, and I was trying to decide between, say, using a tape machine or a black box, I would consider how I want the lows handled. If I felt that the lows of my drums were already kind of beefy enough, and really what I was looking for was just a little bit of that kind of splat sound, a little bit of kind of vibe to the drums, I might reach for the black box. But if I felt that my drums were undersized compared to what I was going for, there wasn't enough, weight in them, then I think I would reach for the tape in that situation. But these two are essentially, to me, they're in the same realm and they're giving me a vibe. It's just really kind of where I want the impact to be, and I feel more of the impact in the lows with tape. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about when it comes to tape compression is what's called compansion. And compansion is a combination of compression and expansion. And this came based off using noise reduction systems inside the tape units. Now, the Studer doesn't actually model this. There is no noise reduction area in here other than you can reduce the actual hum and hiss. But the Dolby A, this was actually part of the systems. And the calibration of these, you had to be very meticulous because you used it two ways. You used it first as essentially an exciter where you sent more high frequency into the recording process. And what that basically did was it helped to bring up the quieter parts of the high end and essentially kind of like increase the noise floor. Like these started kind of in the late 60s, again, for like noise reduction. And essentially what it is it's like almost like a vintage multiband dynamic processor. And what people started realizing was they started using the encoder aspect, which UA, who just came out with this plugin, calls Excite, but the encoder area, which added, basically it was kind of preparing the signal for tape. And we can hear what it does if we cue this up with the Studer, and I'll have it on bypass, and then I'll add it in. So you could hear all that high frequency being pumped in. So if I keep this open and I bring down another version and then I put it on what would be the decoding process, which is what you would hear during playback. And again, we'll just keep them really simple, fully wet and minimum processing. So we have it on the encoder mode feeding into the tape machine. So this would print onto the tape. And then you would have the decoding, which basically applied some expansion. It brought the highs that were overinflated down, but it also kind of brought the noise floor back down. You could think of, the encoding part is like if you were whispering something, like the machine putting a megaphone in front of it. And then on the decoding part, bringing that whisper back down to a whisper volume. So I'll have the decoding part in bypass, and we'll hear just first the encoding. It's bringing up a lot of the crispiness of the hats. So this would be printed to tape. What we just heard would be printed to tape. And now on playback, you'd have to have a decoder that would bring it back down to normal. So we'll start with what it would be like with all this hitting the tape, and then we will take it off and hear how it's kind of restored. So we have a level drop, but you could hear how we basically return kind of to form. And that is how the Compansion process, worked through like a Dolby A system. Now you might be wondering, because it was one of the first things I wondered is, well, wait a second, if this prints to tape and this is part of the unit that we're hearing during playback, what happens if I record in one studio, take my tape and then go to another studio and play it back? And that is where, sometimes you could run into issues, or actually people began to later on manipulate this. This Dolby A type in the encoding phase was used a lot for vocals. You might have heard people mention like the Dolby vocal mixing trick or things like that, acoustic guitar mixing trick, or the John Lennon trick. It's probably got a bunch of different names. But essentially, it was using just the encoding phase to add a lot of top end to some vocals to give it kind of that sizzle or that sparkle and to not make it feel dull. But you can imagine why they had to take calibration of these machines so seriously, because you could go and record in one encoding system and then pick up that tape, go somewhere else. And if you didn't have the similar calibrations, or if you were, doing any sort of like tape transfers, you could run into an issue where things started to feel a little dull, a little lifeless, or, not definitely sounding the way that they were intended to sound. And also why I think it's important to know is, like, for example, one of the plugins that I love to use, which is another tape emulation plugin called Satin. So now you can see we have this Compansion section in Satin, and let's watch. So I'm going to shut the decoder off for a second. So we're going to go to none. We'll go to, oh, look at that, A type. What do you think that's modeled after? And let's listen to what happens with just the encoder on. And you could hear how the top end became very inflated, very crispy, and also compressed. And that's something I probably should have done a better job of mentioning when we first jumped into this Compansion discussion, is that we are adding in a lot of like upper frequency, but it sounds like if you put a multi-band compressor on the high end, started compressing, and then boosted that compressed signal. It doesn't feel open, it feels very crunched up in the top. But you could hear how once we set the decoder to the same as the encoder, that we got a similar response running through the Compansion section, which again, if you have something like Satin or you grab the UA type, you can, manipulate this like many engineers did when this was a tool that they found that was worth manipulating. You can inflate your high end in a very kind of compressed and controlled, but like crispy and hyped up kind of way. It's almost like an exciter, pre actual excitement tools. So I hope that you found all of this is interesting as I did. And again, really what we are doing and attempting to do with the conversations that we're having on this channel is to look at these and understand a lot of their intended use back when they were the tools that were actively being used in recording studios prior to everything moving inside the box, and also understand their builds and their typologies like we did with compressors, and understanding the components that are inside them, how they, can influence the sound we're looking for. And sometimes with just that little bit of extra information that we gather from understanding this, it leads to us using less plugins because we are making better choices and sharpening our ears to what to listen for. And, most of the time reaching our desired sounds with much greater confidence, less processing, which keeps things, in my opinion, a lot more open and punchy and, transparent, which is part of my sound now. Of course, if you're like, hey, but guess what? My sound is heavily processed, super crunched and, like entirely manipulatable, then what I'm saying right now is like, putting a cross in front of a vampire. But for those that are interested in really wanting to get under the hood of a lot of pieces of gear and understand how you can use that information to manipulate, choices in your mix, that's really what we're talking about. So the last thing that I have here that I thought was just going to kind of fun was I built what would have almost been like a straight, analog recording chain on our drums. So typically you'd hit your preamp in your console. I'm not going to do any EQ, even though I engaged the EQ. So we're just kind of running through the Neve, like if we're going through a Neve console. And then from there, we're going into our encoder, which is going to send some upper frequencies into a tape. I have this tape plugin by Studer here set on sync, which is the closest that we can get to record here, because that would be like their kind of overdub head. So we're going first into the record. Then from there, we're going into a playback. So I have the next one set on repro, modest levels, we're not going crazy. And then we're going to our decode here, back to our console, right? Where we might be doing a mix, and then we are sending it to our, final mix down tape, or you want to call it the tape we're sending off to mastering, which is our 456 half-inch +3. Basically just set it to 456 master preset that they had here, and just to keep it simple. And let's kind of listen first with the whole chain off. It's got a really cool sound to it. I love what's going on. The kick really blooms. The transients are retained because we're not right now with the settings that we have here, we're not manipulating anything to start to intentionally distort or blow up. We're keeping things pretty moderate, and we're just kind of passing the drums through this chain as, say, would have been done in like a responsible recording session where the goal wasn't to blow anything up, but rather to kind of just keep things transparent in how they sound in a room. Let's listen one more time. So if you have any interest in doing that, you can actually, set this up a variety of ways inside your mix. But essentially, you want to think for the recording process, you're going console, so that could be any kind of channel strip or console emulator. I mean, there's probably thousands of things out there, into an encoder. If you don't have an encoder, you could, if you remember from our other thing, you could just pop into your high frequency driver here and, kind of manipulate that as well and just drive more high end in. That way, it would give you a similar effect. The only thing that you'll have an issue with might be with the playback and not having the decode. But if you have a Satin plugin, or if you do have this UA type, or just get the demo and mess with it and see if it's your vibe and if it does give you some extra juice in your mix that you really like. But the recording would be a console to your encoder to tape, and then your playback would be tape to your decode to your console, and then to your mix down reel. And that's kind of a fun little analog chain. And I really kind of dug what it did to the drums. And in full disclosure, I'll probably save this as like a preset for a template. And if I want kind of and I'll probably call it something like tapey drums or something. And if I want to have drums that have that kind of vibe, I'll just pop this on as like, say, my main drum bus, and kind of run my drums into it and kind of get this kind of tape mojo thing happening. So I hope you found this useful, and lots of kind of cool little nuggets of information or things that you can take and apply to what it is you're doing. But I think the most important thing, again, is to remember that, tape is a medium, and what we're kind of doing is we're manipulating that medium to kind of drive outcomes. So the way that we get better at that is by really understanding all the components to tape. And when I say tape, and we're using tape now, I mean, let's be honest, 99% of us, are going to have a plug-in version. Why? Because the plug-in is a lot cheaper than buying a very expensive tape unit, much easier to maintain, and doesn't, have an actual footprint in, in a room, and can just live inside the computer. So I know that there's a lot of, super tape enthusiasts, and I am one, that will kind of chime in and, mention that, hey, well, this is different than real tape. And it is, but we're discussing, how we can understand those properties and utilize the tape tools that the majority of us, have. And, as we progress down the road, I'm always happy to do shootouts between real tape and this. But for most of us that are mixing right now and are looking to, apply some sort of tape vibe to what it is we're doing, we're using a plugin. So I feel it's important to help, kind of help provide some history to, the way these plugins are constructed. So I hope you find that useful. Thank you guys again so much for supporting the channel. And I really do hope that you incorporate this into what you're doing, and let me know how it's working out for you in the comments below. Okay, my friends, take care.